Welcome back, motorized bike enthusiast. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I make custom length cables for my motorized bikes. Putting custom cables on your bikes has a few benefits and one negative. The only negative that I can think of is the fact that if you move things around to a different bike, you upgrade things like your handlebars, your levers, your throttle, you could run into issues where a cable might be too short if you made it an absolute perfect fit. So just keep that in mind, but the positives really outweigh the negatives. First off, it's going to look cleaner. Your build's just going to look a lot more slick and custom. Second, you'll have less fatigue for the fact that you'll have smoother engagement on your throttle and your levers. See, the shorter cables have less drag because there's less cable inside the sleeve to create resistance. And with less bends and less tighter bends, you also have a lot less drag. So when you can make a custom length cable that contours to the bike and has nice smooth turns without any sharp corners, you'll just have a better experience. And that does pay off in the long run if you're doing a long trip and you have a really rough engagement because your cables are just so long, your hands really start to tire out. Another nice thing about getting rid of all this crap off the front of the bike is you'll be less likely to snag on the environment. And if you're like me and you run a headlight at night, the shadow of this bobbing around on the road can be really distractive and annoying. The tools we'll be using for this are pretty simple. If you're just doing the brakes and or clutch lever, really all I would use is a driver to loosen your cable, a poker to help clean the hole that we're going to make in the new cable, a cutoff wheel from a Dremel, and some new end caps for the sleeves and the cables. That's pretty much it. Now, if you're doing the throttle cable, it's a little more involved as you're going to need to do some precise measurement, and some soldering. There's other ways to do this with cable repair kits, but this is just how I'm going to be doing it on this particular bike. Now, before we start measuring out the cable length, what I want to make sure I do is both on the motor and on the lever, I have all of the adjustable screws turned in all the way. If your adjuster screws are stripped out, as these do really easy because they're cheap aluminum, I'll leave a link in the description on where I purchased a bag of them for cheap. So now I'm going to make sure that the sleeve is pushed all the way into the adjuster, and I'll go ahead and take the cable and run it along the smoothest path I can to the clutch arm. Now I do want to make sure that I leave a little bit of leeway because I plan on upgrading these handlebars to a flat bar in the future. That means I'll probably end up with a little bit more cable length than I want, but just in case, I don't want it to be too short, so I don't have to do this over again. So now that I've run the cable and I have my thumb right where the cable meets into the adjuster on the motor, I'm going to go ahead and push it out just about 2 inches. So I'll still have a little bit of cable hanging off my bars, but it won't be nearly as much as we did before. All right, so I ran the cable on a nice smooth route where it goes into the adjuster on the motor, right about where my thumb is. So we're going to be chopping off about this much of the sleeve. Now we want to do the sleeve first and not touch the cable. Always do the cable last. All right, so now that we have our mark where we're going to cut, I'm going to take my Dremel and I'm going to try and cut through it as straight and square as I can. So we're cut through. It looks like we're pretty square. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I do have a little bit of a lip right here that I don't want to leave because it could slowly catch on the cable. So I'm just going to go ahead and shave that off, clean it up, and then we'll put our cap on. Now there's an inner sleeve inside of the metal sleeve. It's like nylon, it's some kind of plastic. Usually when you cut through this, it'll get kind of smooshed. So I'll take this pick and put it right down the center and make sure that it's open and clean. Now we're just going to take one of our caps and try and slide it on without catching the plastic outer sleeve. Now you can kind of crimp this on a pair of pliers, a couple little squishes like they do on the stock ones. I'm just going to leave it. I'm not too worried about it. All right, so we're going to run our sleeve through the existing cable. And remember, this cable has not been trimmed yet. When you're tightening up your cable, It's important to make sure that your cable sleeves have not slipped out of the slots like mine has up here on the lever. There we go. Check your lever for excessive play. And it looks like as soon as I touch the clutch lever, it starts to move the arm. And you would want it to be the same for your brakes. All right, we're good there. Now, these clutch cables don't normally come with a cable end cap because if you need to remove the motor from the bike, you'll have to take this off, and these aren't meant to go on and off. Since they're so cheap and I have about 200 of them, I'm going to go ahead and put it on to keep that cable from fraying and to keep this from poking me in the leg. To crimp it, I'll just use the wire cutters and give it a nice little squeeze. And there we go. Now I still have to strap the cable to the frame to keep it from bouncing around, but as you can see, it's no longer hanging way out in front of the bike and it doesn't obscure my headlight anymore. So doing a custom length throttle cable on this particular build has another benefit for me. As you can see, I have quite a bit of play in the throttle itself, and this is with the adjusters on both the throttle side and the carburetor side screwed out almost as far as I can. I can go a little further, but I never like to go to the bleeding edge on these adjuster screws. As we make our custom cable, we'll be able to get rid of this slop and screw our adjusters back in so that we'll have adjustment in the future if we need it. Alright, so we went ahead and removed the carburetor from the bike and we turned our adjuster screws in all the way. Now this isn't the carburetor from the bike, this is just a spare one I had, so I didn't have to worry about draining the fuel. But the process is going to be the same. Now with the adjuster screws in all the way on the carburetor and on the throttle, you'll notice there's this much extra play in the cable. And that is why with the adjusters out all the way, there was still a lot of slop. So we're going to need to take this measurement into account when we go to make our custom length cable. And we have to get this right because if we make it too short, then the bike will idle high. You'll never have a fully closed throttle position. On the other hand, if you make it too long, then you're kind of stuck in the same situation where you have to deal with these adjuster screws. So what I'm going to do to be on the safe side before I take any measurements is I'm actually going to unscrew my adjuster just a little bit. In case I mess up while cutting, I'll have a few millimeters to work with. I'm going to do this both on the carburetor and on the throttle. I'll give it about, I'd say that's 2 millimeters, maybe 3. All right, so now we have our adjusters out just a little bit. Let's go ahead and take a measurement. Now the cable sleeve is going to fit down into this adjuster just a little bit. And it looks like on this particular carburetor, it ends right at the bottom of the crimp, which is convenient for us because that makes it easy to measure. So we're going to measure this smooth section of the cap first. If your cap is different or you don't have a convenient reference point to visually see where you're going to need to measure from, then you can take your pick or a Sharpie and you can mark it so you can measure it. So let's go ahead and see what we're working with on the end of this cap that sits down into the adjuster. Okay, I see 5 millimeters, so half a centimeter, spot on. Now we're going to need to add that to how much cable is sticking out of this cap. Looks like it's right at 1 centimeter. So 1.5 centimeters is what we're going to need to remember. And it's important, make sure when you took this measurement that the cable sleeve is fully seated into the throttle on the handlebars and it's not popped out a little bit, messing up your measurement. Another thing that's important to remember when you're making these custom cable lengths is different carburetors will use different style or different length of adjuster screws. This is the one from the bike we're working on, the NT Speed carburetor, and this is from a generic China doll carburetor. Now that we have our carburetor removed with all its components, we can see how much cable we have sticking out the end of the sleeve. We're going to go ahead and need to measure this now. And just like before, make sure that the other end of this sleeve is fully seated inside the throttle. So with the bottom of the bead as our starting point, it looks like we are 1 millimeter shy of 6 centimeters. And since I gave myself a little wiggle room with the adjusters, I'm just going to call that an even 6 centimeters. Now we'll need to subtract our first measurement of 1.5 centimeters. So we will need to have 4.5 centimeters of cable sticking out the end of the sleeve after we make our custom cut on the cable sleeve. Now, in your situation, if you don't have excessive play in the throttle cable, you don't need to make all those custom measurements. You can go ahead and just take however much you have sticking out of the stock cable, measure that, which for us is 6 centimeters, and then plan on having 6 centimeters sticking out the end of the sleeve after you make your cut. That'll simplify it for you guys, but you might still have to mess with the adjusters. Keep that in mind. So now that we know how much we have to have sticking out the end of our sleeve to get a nice crisp throttle pull, we're going to go ahead and cut off this bead so that we can slide the sleeve off of the cable. And be careful because it will go flying. Another important tip, guys, is if you're running your cable on, say, the left side of the bike, make sure you turn your handlebars all the way to the right. This ensures that in the worst case scenario, you're still going to have enough cable length. And that should give us a nice, smooth throttle pull with enough cable left for future modifications and no excessive cable hanging off the end of the bike. Okay, we'll go ahead and mark it. The thumbnail does the trick. All right, before we start cutting, if you still got your carburetor on the bench, make sure you move it. You don't want to get metal shavings into it. That wouldn't be good for the motor. And just like before, we're going to go ahead and chop this off, trim it, clean it up, and we'll be right back. So we've got our sleeve trimmed to the custom length. We have it inserted into the adjuster screw on the throttle. And we need to go ahead and measure 4.5 millimeters. And that's just about perfect for us. Now we need to make the bead. We're going to go ahead and make the bead for the cable now, and the one that comes with the stock kit is about 3 millimeters tall. So to do that, what I've got here, soldering iron. Those are the bare essentials. I'm also going to be using flux to help the solder stick to the steel cable better, and this is a cleaner for the solder tip, which definitely comes in handy. I've also got this bit of clay, which I can use to help hold the cable in place, because I don't have 3 hands. Now for this, I'm going to go ahead and heat my soldering iron up to its highest temperature, because the cable will want to absorb a lot of the heat very quickly, and at a lower temperature it would just take too long and your solder bead would probably come out pretty crappy. We're going to go ahead and flux the tip of the cable, tin our tip, and make our bead. So we've got a bit of solder tinned onto the tip of the cable. We're going to go ahead and reflux it. So here we've got a nice fat bead, and it looks to be just about the right size. So let's see how we did. That's pretty close. I think that's going to work. Always clean your soldering iron tip off. It's also a good idea to leave a bit of fresh solder on it when you're all done. That helps prevent the tip from oxidizing when you're not using it. To make this cap easier to put on, I'm going to screw my adjusters back in once again. Alright, now, if I did everything right, I should have just a little bit of play in this sleeve. Yep. And we can take that up with the adjusters. Alright, so the only thing left I have to do is to rerun the sleeves through the Velcro straps I had them to really clean it up. But as you can see right now, we got some nice short cables that aren't sticking all out the front of the bike, getting in the way of my light, snagging on stuff. The clutch lever has a nice smooth engagement because it doesn't have that big bend out the front. And the throttle on this bike was always pretty smooth, but it's just a little better now. We no longer have our adjuster screws all the way at the bleeding edge, and we still have just a little play here, which is fine. Check it out, guys, we got our own little mini track. Dropping in.